Renewable energy, business and finance. Renewable energy legend Bill Paul has recently agreed to write financial reports and newsletters for us at 2 Green Energy. We're delighted to have come across such good fortune, as there really is no one more qualified for the task. Bill retired from the Wall Street Journal after a 20-year stint as a staff writer covering the energy sector. Highly respected as an analyst in this space, he's been interviewed on CNBC and numerous other television channels through the years. We're thrilled with the association. I thought readers might like a glimpse into how he thinks and where he sees the renewable energy industry going from the perspective of international corporate finance. Craig Shields, if we could just maybe reprise the conversation that we had at lunch that day, in which you talked about all the fascinating aspects of the various world economies, and financial pressures and trends that have driven renewable energy and electric transportation into the spotlight. Bill Paul, energy is at the crux of all things financial. There is not a single business that does not have energy as a significant cost factor. There is not a single country that does not have energy as a significant national security factor, and there is not a single household that does not have energy as an important budgetary factor. With energy, you are operating on all levels in terms of finance, as well as national security, as well as health consequences. You have privacy issues, property rights issues, basically any personal choice issue on lifestyle, and you have a perfect storm of political, economic, and social interests, all competing for the right approach. CS, what are the privacy issues? BP, when you talk about the smart grid, which is the next point in the evolution of the electric utility industry, you are digitizing the utility industry. This will permit marketers to access people's information and businesses' information, in terms of their energy use and consumption. A company in the future will know how much time I spend in the living room and the bedroom, and how many minutes per day my refrigerator door is open. It will be able to craft sales pitches aimed specifically at those patterns. That raises many serious questions that are equal to, if not above, the questions raised by privacy experts over the Internet. CS, well, that is amazing, good point. This all seems so far advanced from where the utility industry has been in the past. Do financial advisors understand this stuff? What if I'm managing my 401k and I go to my broker and I say, Bob, what do you think of the energy sector? How likely is it that a randomly chosen broker is going to be on top of all this? BP, your average broker will, at best, have a handle on oil and natural gas, the fossil fuels. And that will only be because the traditional energy analysts at his brokerage are sending out reports on a regular basis. The fact of the matter is that, with rare exceptions, there are no real good analysts in the United States today who are concentrating on what you can call the new energy industry, which is essentially the move away from fossil fuels into more than 24 different sources of alternative green clean energy information. Not the least of these is energy efficiency itself, the so-called mega fuel, which is probably the cheapest way to control energy costs and protect national security. But going back to your question, brokers may pretend to know what they are talking about and they know a little bit about oil and gas, but ask them about renewable energy and they will hit a key on their computer and up will pop the solar companies that trade in the United States, and only those companies. Most brokerages do not even want to know about companies whose stocks trade outside the United States, because it is a little more difficult to trade those stocks. The float is a little lax in some instances. So what you are left with is an overindulgence in a handful of solar stocks, not all of which are really very good. People are myopic. hence they do not know about the dozens of other exciting companies with stocks traded around the world. Take geothermal, for example, with 15 or 20 publicly traded companies, most of which are outside the United States, some of which are fantastic in terms of their potential. Brokers are not going to know the first thing about ocean and wind power, or clean coal technologies that are, of course, another aspect of all of this. CS, I would think that part of your job as an analyst in this thing is to not breathe your own exhaust. I would think that there is propaganda being spewed out from all manner of sources. One might be big oil and gas, trying to make everybody believe that there is no such thing as peak oil, but there is such a thing as clean coal. What is the truth on this thing and how do you get at it? BP, today, as we are speaking, it is virtually all about fossil fuels, in terms of their practical presence. You cannot run an automobile unless you have oil refined into gasoline. You cannot turn on your lights without coal that has been used to generate electricity. That is now. As you move forward in time, the reliance on fossil fuels inevitably must decrease. I say inevitably because it is axiomatic that fossil fuels are finite and simultaneously the world population is growing rapidly, as is people's never-ending desire for an increased standard of living. So whether or not there is peak oil in terms of the amount of oil physically that can be extracted from the earth, we are approaching a point in time where the amount of oil that can be extracted is running dangerously close to the demand of that growing population. So, you can say that peak oil is anywhere from 2013 to 2025. That is my reasonable time frame. It is unreasonable to adopt the fact peak oil is here today, which the environmental community often does, and it is unreasonable to adopt the time frame that peak oil is 2050. You have to put all of these factors into place so that they can work off of one another: increase in population, rising standard of living, and the doubling, I repeat, the doubling, of the number of cars on global highways between now and 2030. You simply have to come up with more energy. Don't think of it as saving the planet so much as bumping up against the limits of a finite source of fuel, namely the fossil fuels. So now you inevitably must add into the mix the so-called renewable fuels, fuels that essentially never disappear: wind, solar, geothermal, ocean waves, and so forth. You must move into these fuels to augment your existing supply. By 2020, if we do not have a major change in the percentage of renewable versus fossil fuels that is in use, our standard of living as a nation and as a world will have collapsed. There is just no way around it. We do not have the amount of coal, much less the amount of oil or natural gas. There are some out there right now screaming and yelling about how much natural gas we have, forgetting the fact that those tight rock formations essentially will be drained quickly. That is just a fact of life. There is a lot of gas there today, but it is going to get used up quickly. You have to think out the timeline, and that timeline says renewables must be a significant percentage of everybody's energy consumption within 10 to 15 years. To get there in 15 years, we have to start now. In fact, we are already behind on the journey. Obama just announced yesterday the first 2 nuclear reactor units in this country, which if all goes right, always a big if, will be online no earlier than 2017. We have only 2 baseload sources of electricity, nuclear and coal. We are not currently building any new coal-fired power plants. Period. They cannot get permitted. An ugly little fact of life, that no broker is going to know, is that while we get 50% of our electricity today from coal, the number of coal-fired power plants being shut down by their owners is rapidly on the rise. The number of plants that are now 40 years plus in age is rapidly rising. That is a very critical time in the life of a coal-fired power plant because the owner must decide whether to invest a fortune into life extension work or shut it down. Any broker today should understand, but none of them do, what the options are for the world to get its sources of power and motor fuel in the future. Even in the best of times, Wall Street has maybe half a dozen analysts who really understand the electric power industry. I am not just saying the electric utility industry, but rather the electric power industry, because utilities are only one factor in that. More and more of manufacturing is becoming electrified, moving away from oil. The next step will be transportation, moving away from liquid gasoline over to electric fuel. And you must understand also that the electric power grid is being reinvented to a smart grid which will change how we live, work, and play. Analysts do not get this, and I do not know if there is enough time, frankly, for Wall Street to get up to speed on this. There really are not enough guys. I know the guys who are out there, the best ones are all very long in the tooth now already, and I do not see any kids coming up who really understand it. CS, so what you are saying is that there is a lot of activity that needs to take place today, and there is a lot of investment that needs to take place today. BP, this crisis is probably 5 to 7 years out. And the technologies to solve the crisis right now are just starting to be discovered. But realize this, that is the point at which they are most valuable to an investor. You figure out what the best technologies, the winners, are, right now, and the companies are in existence today. Microsoft, Google before it caught on, or the first guy who discovered oil in western Pennsylvania, all of these breakthroughs had an early day, and in those early days was when the big money could be made, because you could buy low. Right now today, there are literally hundreds of companies, more than 1,000 actually, that are developing the next generation of energy technologies that will be at the core of harnessing all of these renewable power sources. We are in the early stages for all the good stuff right now. And the investor who gets in today, and by today I mean from 2010 to 2012, is the investor who in 2020 will be very glad he made those decisions. Energy is the biggest industry in the world, and it is slowly but surely converging with the other biggest industries in this world, telecom, IT, and transportation. All of the major industries in the world are beginning to coalesce into the new energy generation. Of course, some are going to fall by the wayside and die. Eventually, however, the ones with the really good technologies will, in my estimation, be acquired by the big boys because energy is such a big industry that only the big boys have deep enough pockets to play in this game. GE, Philips, Johnson Controls, IBM, Siemens, ABB, all of these monsters are going to be acquiring dozens of companies each to fulfill their specific needs. And you will see these technologies blossom into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. For anyone with a 5-year time horizon, I do not see a better investment opportunity than new energy. CS, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I tend to take a US-centric view of the world. And I know from talking to you that the most exciting possibilities you see are actually happening elsewhere. Can you speak to that, please? BP, no one will ever confuse the European Union with China. But in point of fact, both are passing government policy measures that are propelling the alternative energy industry forward in ways that the United States is not. We are getting so far behind. For example, by 2020 in the UK, every residence will have a smart meter, bar none, So the smart grid essentially will be in place to a great extent by 2020 in the UK. You have motor vehicle rules being passed, you have biofuel rules being passed by the European Union, you have biomass rules being passed in the UK, you have waste-to-energy power plants being passed, you have carbon recovery projects, taking the CO2 from a coal-fired power plant, capturing it and transporting it to the North Sea where it will be used to pull more oil out of the ground. All of this is happening essentially under EU edict, and there are hundreds of companies that are in the business of meeting these new requirements. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, you have the Chinese government that is simply doing all of this unilaterally. It is a battle today between the EU and China in my mind, with Korea and Japan separately trying to play catch-up and the US twiddling its thumbs and yelling from one party to the other. There is a conspiracy theory out there that China did its best to muck up Copenhagen to keep the US political cauldron boiling over on climate change so it could, very quietly, keep pushing full throttle on development of all this stuff. In China right now they are building wind farms so fast that half of the generation capacity cannot even be hooked up yet to the power grid. They'll be putting in high-voltage power lines. Ironically, some of the very best, most efficient new technologies being used in power lines are coming from a couple of companies in the United States who cannot make a single sale in the United States, but they are making a small fortune in China. CS, wow. What's happening in Nepal? BP, You may have gotten me there. CS, I was kidding. I just picked an obscure country. BP, nothing to my knowledge in Nepal, but there is some very cool stuff going on with wind in Mongolia. The Chinese have branched out there because the winds are very, very good. Just like there used to be gold prospecting, now there is wind prospecting. There is ocean wave prospecting. They were all over the Tokyo Bay about a year ago looking for the best current. And again, each one of these things requires the technology to capture and convert it into usable electricity. Now, what is the beauty of that? We use less coal. It has less environmental damage. I think it is the IEA's, International Energy Agency, numbers that say we have a requirement for 50% more electricity globally by 2030 than today, with at least 20 to 25% increase just here in the United States. That is an enormous amount of increased demand. Now think about that and realize that there is not a single coal-fired power plant being permitted. Now you see why renewables have nowhere to go but up. Let me hasten to add that this all comes a cropper, if the government does not get its act together on transmission lines. We need, right now, something like 1,000 miles more of new high-voltage transmission lines. And we need them to be smarter than today's lines because they are going to need to be able to incorporate into the mix all of these intermittent renewable power sources. And here's another thing, no one has done the hard preliminary work on ensuring reliability of the electrical power system in this country. As usual, the government has gone off, half-assed, ordering up all of these new wind farms and solar projects. And absolutely nobody knows with any certainty how they will affect the grid, and whether the lights will in fact stay on. I mean, that is just remarkably stupid. Now you couple that with the ever-present travel of state regulators, each of whom has a little fiefdom that can hold up a necessary power line for an eternity if it chooses to. Some of these state regulators are willing to reward their utilities for taking steps to make our nation's electricity usage more efficient, but others are not, so you do not even have a national policy today for energy efficiency. You have a lot of gobbledygook coming out of Washington about the need for it, but that immediately runs up against 10, 12, 15 state regulatory commissions. They will not allow a financial return on an investment by a utility and all of that. That is insane, but that is our system. I am more optimistic about that payoff for an investor who invests in all of these 24 or so technologies than I am on whether this country will get its act together sufficiently to keep the lights on. That said, not that China is that much more brilliant than we are, but they know they need to go full throttle on renewable energy just to keep up. That is where we are going. We are at the creek. We have roadblocks coal, and we have taken an eternity to get nuclear back. That announcement yesterday doesn't mean that nuclear will be operational in 2017 because you still have this left-wing element out there which says no nuke is a good nuke. But here's my point, whenever there is a crisis there is investment opportunity. That strikes me as an opportunity to invest in dozens and dozens of different companies, all of whose prospects look very bright. Yet we are stuck on Wall Street in a 1950s mentality, where it is oil, natural gas, or coal, but it is basically just the same old stuff. Nothing ever changes with energy. I mean, how can these guys be so out of place? You know, and all the best minds on Wall Street frankly have gone over to Europe. Now Asia is emerging as the alternative energy hedge fund capital. CS, wow, that is amazing. Well, this has been remarkable, as I knew it would be, Bill. Thanks so much. For more information on this contributor, please visit http://2greenenergy.com/ renewable-energy-facts-fantasies/